All right, what's up? Here we go. Okay, let me know when the camera comes on. For whatever reason, my stream preview only shows my intermission screen. It's too hot. I can see you. That is very creepy. Thank you. All right, I'm assuming you can hear me then. Oh, that's good. All right. So let's chat. So just as there it is. I got a massive delay. It must be like 30 seconds. I got to figure out why it's got such a delay. I'll deal with it next time. Okay, guys. So thanks for joining me. We're going to be talking about the sort of post-colonial situation in South Africa. And we're going to be doing it as a contrast to what happened in India. Now, it's a little complicated because it's actually quite different, okay? So we tend to hear like these stories as kind of synonymous or similar stories. You know, you have a British colony or former British colony. There's racism, there's suppression of the local people, and there is a movement to get rid of them. But there is a huge difference, really, between what happens with India and what happens with South Africa in a lot of different ways. So let's start first with kind of the basics. The basics is there is a difference between Southern Africa, the region, and South Africa, the country. Okay, these are different. It wasn't called South Africa, the country, for much of its history. So probably the simplest thing to do is going to be to actually just utilize Wikipedia as just a guidepost. That's what we're going to use it for, just a way to sort of get through one topic to the next, okay? So in this timeline, what you got here is sort of the left to right ancient history kind of thing to where we sort of end up in their situation. So I want to summarize even some of the earlier bits, the fairly recent stuff. I don't want to go back to like, 4,000 BC, 4 million BC. We don't need that. But we do need to go to the part where the Dutch show up. So I was asked today in class, can I at some point go over big dates that sort of change history kind of thing? I would not put one of these as big dates that change history, but it changes this country's history. So right around 1650. Now, here's one of those dates that changes actual history. 1450, right? By 1450, Portuguese are sailing around the coast of Africa, trying to see if they can get to these waters of, hey Ray, from South Asia all the way to East Asia, seeking out the lands that the Europeans call Cathay, which is another word that they had for China. They didn't know what to call it. Somehow it's called Cathay. And as the Portuguese are accomplishing that, by 1492, a couple of Italian lunatics decide the better way to do things is to sail west, right? Get there before the Portuguese do. And I remind you, I guess a global map wouldn't hurt at all. We'll get back to De Beers Diamonds in a minute. Give me global map. Okay. Sure, that'll do. Okay, so remember the idea of Columbus in 1492 was to sail from Spain. He's Italian, right? Sail from Spain and go west. Not in the attempt to find any new lands. He didn't think there were new lands. Nobody thought there were new lands. Instead, the thought was they wanted to get to this region over here. Let me move my fat head. They want to get to this region over here, to what the Europeans called the Spice Islands, which was the Portuguese plan as well. So the Portuguese figure, hey, let's go bounce along the African coast, come up the other way, get into these waters of places like India and into Southeast Asia, and then we'll have control of the spice trade that way. The Columbus' plan was to go west and get over here. And as we mentioned, he dies thinking that he has actually found those islands. Again, if you really do look at it in sort of an abstract way, if all you know is that you're looking for a place that, is said to be a bunch of islands south of a large landmass, well, the Caribbean is basically a bunch of islands south of a large landmass, just like Southeast Asia is a bunch of islands south of a large landmass. So that was where the idea for, okay, Columbus thinks he's over here. I gotta get off this map. I can't stand these damn ads. But that's the sort of the reason why Portuguese, the Spanish, really the Italian explorers, but the Spanish go that way, and the Portuguese bounce along. Those Portuguese bouncing along, remember, create ports. So really, they're the first Europeans to make contact with these people in South Africa. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind as we go. Get rid of this. Go back to this. Now, how did the Dutch get here? The Dutch get here because they defeat the Portuguese, basically. Remember, there was kind of like a counter wave of Dutch exploration and competition for the very waters the Portuguese had once explored and dominated. Remember, a lot of those places, like Japan, China, Southeast Asia especially, were places where the Portuguese once had real significant sway, in some cases even literal controls, and end up actually turning that into, in some cases, a actual colony. In the case of, like, for example, Southeast Asia, the island of Java was a Dutch colony. So the Dutch had wiped out basically Portuguese presence in the region for the most part. And one of the most important things you could have would be South Africa. Why? Really simple. It's not going to be until the Suez Canal is created. Now, let me real quick on the Suez Canal. Get back to these guys. I want to say 56, 66, 1858. I was close. It didn't finish until 1869. So Suez Canal, for those who don't remember or don't know, the Suez Canal. I need that world map after all. Hang on. Sure, we'll use Mercator. Why not? This works. All right, the Suez Canal goes right through or basically splits the Sinai Peninsula here, and allows passage from basically straight from water from the Indian Ocean right up into the Mediterranean Sea. It is an artificial canal built by human beings post-industrial age. So you're talking, if you have your Dutch down here in 1650, let's say, and they're settling there, it's not going to be for about 200 years ish that there's any other way to get from Europe to South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. So the strategic value of South Africa is its reason of importance. I want you to understand that. It is strategically important to own it. If you own this place, you control a whole lot. There is Cape Town here, which is basically a major port that is going to be used to refit, resupply, anchor in British, well, at this point Dutch, then later British Navy. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Now, these Dutch settlers arrive, and unlike most colonies at this time, I want to remind you, these start to become settlers. Okay, these the Boers, Boers, which again in Dutch is more pronounced like Boers, like a V, like to combine like a V and a B sound together. But we'll call them Boers. It's just easier. The Boers really just mean the trekkers, the settlers. These are basically farmers who are showing up with the full intent to colonize and live in this colony. The most close approximation in world history to these people is going to be the American pilgrims who come to the colonies with the full intention of establishing like actual livable colonies, Jamestown, things like that. Stay there and live there and die there. Like that is the plan, right? This is not a vacation spot. It's not the intent to one day go home. The intent is we're going to move our family to this land and really rug it out, make it work in this foreign place, completely alien to us. Now, obviously, to do that, you're going to need to have weapons. Now, these guys are not really soldiers. These are not like conquistadors, like in Spain, where they're sort of Spanish adventurers seeking wealth, fame, and fortune in any way they can find it, in whatever form it might take. These guys are people that come with families. And so their goal is to show up, and they're kind of like a self-trained militia. They work together in their communities, and they fight off the local natives, and the first the Portuguese briefly, and then local natives, in order to establish their colonies. So there's already intercolonial conflict between the white Dutch settlers in South Africa and these black South African tribes, of which there are many, and some will become more important than others. Now, we'll skip ahead a bit in the timeline here. And we'll go from the Dutch Cape Colony to British Cape Colony. So what actually happens? Well, what you can see that Dutch colony stays in place until almost 1800, right? Long time. And what you're going to actually run into here, give me a second, is going to be this. So this map is actually helpful. Let me see if I can find something here that will... Okay. I'll do my best to describe it, for lack of a better term. So what starts to happen is more and more people from other parts of Europe begin to arrive in South Africa. It's not really so much that they are drawn to it specifically, but rather it starts to become a place where disenfranchised Europeans who are either fleeing persecution or something similar will head as one of the places in the world that they could go to perhaps live the life they want to live and start over in a new place. So a good example of that kind of a migration are the Huguenots. The Huguenots, or the Huguenots, are French Protestants who are basically brutalized by the French government under several different regimes, where the Catholic French kings wanted to eliminate this Protestant group. And so there were a series of actual towns and cities, fortified towns and cities in France that came under fire and attack by the French military. And again, this is 1688. That stuff will continue on. These Huguenots will continue to be persecuted well into and approaching the French Revolution. So you're talking throughout the 1700s. And so a lot of them just say the hell with that, and they try to find a place on earth where they can live peacefully. You know, I want to remind you, if you go back to like those early, oh boy, let's go back to Jamestown Colony, okay? So the Jamestown Colony is 1607, right? And it served as a colonial capital from 1616 to 1699. Of course, I'm talking about Jamestown in America, in Virginia, right? You should have learned about that. So if you actually compare it, right, people don't often do this, but this is really how history is supposed to work. Where did I go here? Here we go. So while the colonial settler project in the American colonies is ongoing and it's functioning and is actually fairly successful in a second iteration, it's not surprising to find that other Europeans are going to look at that as like a potential success story. Like, well, here's a place where people have gone. They get to avoid the sort of the people and the authorities that have traditionally sort of hammered on them, and they find some peace, they find some quiet, they find some place in the world where they, you know, in their head they're thinking this, where they can live out their lives. So if you want to be a Protestant French Christian, it's a hell of a lot easier to do that somewhere other than Catholic France. That said, it's not like they were necessarily super welcome here, but it also wasn't like these Dutch settlers had a super organized government or anything really like that. They were really like a confederation of independent farmers that had been engaging in on-again, off-again fights and skirmishes with local black Africans in an attempt to push them away from the coast so Europeans could take more of the land. And you can see for yourself that expansion here. Like, it starts very, very, very small in 1700 when you get like the actual definition of Cape Colony for the first time. And then on it grows and grows and grows as more and more people emigrate in. Eventually, this whole area, and you'll start to see it being a thing here, this whole area falls into the crosshairs, I'll call it, of both the French and the British. Both of whom see this as a necessity for strategic purposes. They want to own Cape Colony. They want to own South Africa. The British see it as an essential to their empire. Right, by 1781, you know, try to remember, the British are well entrenched in India. The British East India Company is traveling around the world doing what they do. The British see this as a major part of their growing need. Obviously, the British have already lost the American colonies here by 1781, right? 1778 is the revolution, I want to say. So if we're talking those time periods, then you've already got a problem there. So they've already lost that chunk of stuff. So the British are looking to solidify their hold on various things. The British are also now in active warfare with the French. They've been in warfare with the French during the entire American Revolution because the French backed the American revolutionaries. They were in war with the French during the time before that in what's sometimes called the French and Indian War if you're studying a U.S. history class, but is usually called the 7 Years' War if you're studying world history. And this was a French and British conflict. So the French and British have been at it now for 50 years in on-again, off-again naval and land warfare. So the fact that they're competing for who can snatch up this part of Africa is not surprising at all. This is 100 years before the scramble for Africa. Nobody in Europe has the ability to go into interior Africa, not least of which because, you know, the malaria will kill them. So eventually, sparing you a lot of details, there is a battle in which the UK the United Kingdom of Great Britain ends up taking and controlling Cape Colony. Okay? And they just win it. They win it in a battle against the theoretically the Netherlands army, but really it's mostly an army of these Boers. And there's also some black Africans who are involved in kind of a three-way war. But we'll spare the details. You don't really need to know them. But this is when the British take over. So now understand the kind of white melting pot you have here. It's important to understand that. In American history, you learned about WASP, right? White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. You learned about that in American history. In South Africa, it's not WASP, but it kind of is. You have whites, but they're not from any one place or even any one tradition. You've got British whites, you've got Dutch whites, and you have French whites, and you have a few others as well. They're not Anglo-Saxon. The British are, but the Dutch are the Dutch, and the French are the French, and they're not the same. They're all pretty much Protestants. That's true, but they're not all the same kind of Protestants. So some are Lutherans, some are Calvinists, and so on. There is differences here. So they don't all speak the same language. They don't all communicate the same way. At this time period, not like today, English is not the world's most dominant language. French was the world's most dominant language. In fact, there is a term, lingua franca, which is meant to represent the language of the world at the time. So, like, what is the lingua franca today? Well, it is English. Most parts of the world, you can find people that speak English. But the term lingua franca actually means the French language. So it was... in its day, it was the language of world communication, of education, and of scholarship was French. So this is a situation that's here. Now, there is a little bit of back and forth where the British will cut a deal that allowed them to transfer ownership back to the Netherlands, but they get certain port rights. I don't want to really worry too much about that. The final bottom line is they eventually just take the whole damn place over. Like, that's it. They take it over. Now, couple of interesting factors. 1807. Not that you need to know these dates, but just notice notice the trend of things. 1807, the slave trade to South Africa is actually abolished. So slavery to this colony is abolished. But slavery remains legal. That's not so different than the American Constitution. The American Constitution in the Connecticut Compromise actually said, hey, we will end slavery as an importated product. You can't import a slave anymore. However, what you can still do is own slaves, and of course, if your slaves make slave babies, then you'll own that baby too. That was the American model. And you kind of get something like that here. There are a number of wars that break out between various different kingdoms that are South African blacks in South Africa with a collection of white powers, because as you're going to start to see, this map kind of demonstrates this a little bit. There are going to be different areas here of what we call South Africa, and not all of them are going to be owned by the British, because there are going to be some of these Dutch that simply refuse to be ruled by the British, so they just push further inland and kind of escape their old sort of territory that they had colonized and just push Africans out of those other territories. But the thing is, it was like the Native American situation in the American West. As America pushed west and pushed natives west, natives that were traditionally in conflict are now suddenly being forced into the same territories, and they're in conflict. And, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So you could find situations in the American West where, for instance, Native American tribes that were traditionally enemies come to view the United States military as a joint enemy of both of them. And so they make common cause with each other in order to attack the Americans. You see this, for example, like with the death of Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So that kind of stuff was fairly common, actually. And make no mistake, Europeans are still absolutely practicing this idea of divide and conquer. Can I get native peoples to hate each other long enough that they don't notice that I'm actually running the show? We saw that happened and worked very well in, for example, Rwanda for the Belgians, and it led eventually to the Rwandan genocide. That colonial legacy had sunk so deeply into the minds of these people that they actually were convinced that their very neighbors were in fact some entirely different alien racial group, despite the fact they were all like genetically the same line. But you run into that stuff in history in this time period because that is the legacy of colonialism. It's very much an intended idea, intended consequence. Now, I'm moving forward to... Don't mind me as I look for what I want. Okay. The Zulus... Actually, this map would be perfect. So, around the early 1800s, a singular black African tribal nation, and I do want to call them a nation because they really were. They were a complex state, known as the Zulu Empire, defeats and dominates its rivals in the region, becoming an actual militaristic threat. Now, you get this like noble savage imagery here. Like you'll see this. This is like, you can tell a European drew this. This is called noble savage art. They take a person that they want to portray as being a savage, but they have a perfect physique. They're like the noble or the enlightened or the it's a shame this person's not white portrayal of a native black, right? However, the basics are true. Spear, shield, that's basically true. These people did have access to firearms, the Zulus, but nothing like the level of firepower, say, the British military could muster. Now, we're talking, pre-American American Civil War, so we don't have, like, rifles yet, but you do have muskets. You do have those large musket regiments like you saw in the Napoleonic Wars and things like that. Napoleon, again, by 1820 is very much defeated. He's kind of beaten by 1815. So the British are absolutely dominant in world history right now. And you can see for yourself that you have the British and Boer kind of collective Cape Colony, where British, French, and the Boers are the Dutch are all living together. You have a number of sort of black African tribes that are all being subjugated by this growing Zulu empire. And so the Zulus become the real actual threat to the Cape Colony for the first real time, that there was an actual organized, resistance, not just several tribes or a tribe or two attacking colonial outposts or colonial villages, but rather an actual resistance element. And so there is a war that breaks out, okay? I'm going to see if I can find some imagery from it. This is a good example of it, but hang tight on that. Yeah, that's a little bit late. Okay, so we'll use this map for a minute, and then we'll do it this way. I don't need this article anymore. So, the Boer War, there are several. Were basically a series of conflicts, kind of like the Opium Wars was a series of conflicts, between the British and the Boers and the Zulus and a few other sort of smaller factions within this region. And it basically ended up as follows, to spare you the details. The British end up winning. In part of that victory, the Boers, as well as a lot of the remaining Zulus, for example, are forced to flee the area that is known as Cape Town. They take up arms against the British. They decide to try to fight for sort of a Boer independence. At the same time, there's a three-way war between everybody and the Zulus. And in the end, the British just emerged victorious. Again, sparing you details. And so, a lot of the Boers actually elect to simply found their own countries. They just bail out. And they say the hell with it. And they go and found their own countries, their own colonies further in. And in general terms, the British don't pursue it. The British really are kind of only interested in controlling the Cape Colony itself because of its productive capabilities and because of its access as a major strategic port. Other than that, the British don't have a ton of interest here. Now, interests do develop. So, for example, you may have heard of De Beers diamonds. If you haven't heard of De Beers diamonds, your parents certainly have heard of De Beers diamonds. You probably have heard the phrase "diamonds are forever." Well, De Beers was a company founded by a British imperialist called Cecil Rhodes. And they were a diamond company. They're like the world's largest diamond company. They have an effective monopoly on diamond production in the world, at least natural diamond production. They have purposely mined a great many diamonds out of South Africa and kept them under lock and key to limit global production to drive up the value of those things. I mean, these became the motivations for a place like South Africa beyond the strategic need, Like, why do people care about it after the British have clearly dominated the waterways and there's no real threat to their power? Well, it became for other reasons like this. Like, it became a place where you can extract some kind of valuable resource. Now, let's speed it up. As I said, I'm hoping there's a map. There may not be. If I don't find it, that's fine. This handsome fella. Yeah, okay. So there really isn't a map super clear. Here's the Second Boer War. Yes, there were concentration camps. Absolutely. Okay. This is a British concentration camp. So just to show you, like, the world is, as I always like to make the point, and I think it's a valid one, there's very few good guys in the world. And I mean that throughout history. There's a whole lot of shades of bad guy, if you go back in any culture's history, and I think any is not an exaggeration, you're going to find plenty of horrific bloodshed. You're going to find plenty of human rights violations. It is not a monopoly owned by any one group of people. And although almost every culture will claim the moral high ground, the truth is nobody walks with angels. And if they tell you they are, it's always very dangerous to listen. So, the British in this war, this is the Second Boer War, actually had captured, as you could see, very clearly children, civilians, and more as hostages. So they basically would round up the families and Boers that were not involved in the fighting on the fringes of the colony. And the idea was, well, your Boer husband is out there fighting us and bushwhacking the British soldiers and ambushing us on the fringes of your colony, so we're not going to arrest your ass and put you in a concentration camp. A great many Boers will die in these concentration camps, children as well, malnutrition, starvation, exposure to the elements. I mean, there was no like real housing here. People were herded in these little villages, like these little places here. So this idea that children could, being brutalized in war and put in the middle of these sort of horrific conflicts and being treated this way is sort of a rarity. That's just untrue. The world's full of all kinds of impossible brutality. All you have to do is go looking for it. You won't have to look very far. But in the end, the Boer Wars end effectively with British in control. Now, the other colonies, the other groups of Boers, for lack of a better term, they end up sort of forming their own colonies. And the British begin to kind of lose interest, especially in the lead up to World War I. As Africa in general becomes a more important thing, especially after the Suez Canal is made. Once the Suez Canal is put into place and is fully created, and again, the plan goes back to 1866, the British don't need this place anymore. Like, once the Suez Canal becomes a real possibility, the British are like, we don't need this anymore. So the British are kind of happy to sort of cut it loose. And so what they do is they turn it into a commonwealth. Now, if you don't know what a commonwealth is, the British actually has several commonwealths. Canada was a commonwealth. And these are places that they're under the umbrella of the British Empire kind of thing, but they're self-governing. Now, who do they leave to self-govern this new Union of South Africa, they call it? And you can call it like 1900 to make the year easy. Well, they leave a very odd group in charge. This group, as you can see from this fellow right here, was a group of whites that were typically of a mixture of British, French, and Dutch descent. They're their own culture. They're their own racial group. They even have their own language. They're called the Afrikaners with a K. You will definitely see this, so let me show you that. It shouldn't take me very long. Afrikaners. There we go. So the Afrikaners are these, again, Dutch, British, French mixture settlers who are going to become, or who do become, the dominant racial group. They're whites. Okay, they're whites. That's important. The dominant racial group within South Africa. They speak their own language, which is Afrikaans, which is again this kind of pidgin language, Pidgin, pidgin meaning like Creole or patois, or there are a number of languages that are sort of an amalgamation of other languages, and that's what this one is. It's an amalgamation of English and Dutch and some Swahili even, and this whole thing is basically its own language. So these white Afrikaans run South Africa. That's the deal. Now, if you look at South African demographics, and this is still basically true now, I imagine yep, that'll do. Okay, that's not the easiest thing to read. Let's see if we can find it a little bit. There we go. It's much, much better. Okay. Now, this is current, but current is fine. In South Africa, as you can see, and what's funny is that these are the actual racial groups we're going to talk about. Yes, they're called this, okay? Okay, so Afrikaans are neither. Ray is asking, are they Native Africans or are they British? Okay, so here's what they are. First off, sort of yes, right? So first off, they're white. Remember, the Dutch have been here for 200 years. So what's a Native African now? Like, understand, you can have white Native Africans. We have to be careful about just saying, that's why I call them South African blacks. Because they're now South African whites whose grandfathers were born in South Africa. Like, really think that through for a second, right? If a people have been there for 200 years, 150 years, your grandpa was born here. Ray will use you as an example. How many generations do we have to go back before Ray Tang's people ain't from America? Probably not that many. So if you think about it, if your great-grandfather and your grandfather and your dad and obviously your mother's side of the family were all born in South Africa, you feel like you are South African. Especially when your people don't have any real ties to the homeland anymore. Like, you're not, in the same way like Americans don't go, well, we're British. Like, I mean, I joke about being Italian, but I'm not Italian. I'm American, right? So, same deal here. They have no ties to their homeland of the Netherlands in any real way. They might have, like, cousins there or something, but it's obviously their own thing. Yeah, it's a mixed race, exactly. But I want to be clear, it's a mixed white race. Like, the white matters in this case. It's not like, for instance, where in the New World, you had the white guy who marries the Indian woman, and is their kid white, or is they kind of white, or is they, no, this is very clear here. The racial politics of South Africa are its foundational principle. And the reason I bring up this chart is to show you that these whites, where it says white, you can read Afrikaner on this chart. That's simple. Read it that way. So why are they significant? They're significant because when the British finally say around 1900, we really don't need this place anymore. We have the Suez Canal. There's no reason to control South Africa politically. And we have a bunch of sort of a white underclass here that is the defeated remains of the Dutch peoples that have over the ages now married British and married into each other, and they're now their own racial group, the Afrikaans. So the British basically say to them, we're turning over control of this colony to you. Not to the black majority, not in a democratic way. We're turning over control of this white colony to you. Now, I'm taking a very complicated thing, and I'm making it very simple. But in the end, that is what happens. The white Afrikaners are given control of the country to run in the absence of a British government. They're not running it for the British. They're independent. They're part of the imperial umbrella of the lands of the King and the Queen of England. But beyond that, they're independent. There's a lot of places like this. Australia, Canada, a lot of places that fall under this idea of a commonwealth. So, the most important noticing thing, they're a brand new country called South Africa. In this case, the Union of South Africa. Now, the most important thing about them is that they are a minority. They are a significant minority. This is modern day, right? But compared to the blacks, and the blacks are like 3-to-1 whites, it was even worse than that in those days. It was probably 5 blacks to every white, something like that. And of course, the blacks were the actual natives of the region. You go back probably 20 generations, their people were from there. So they had a longer history in the region. They were obviously the more numerical people. If you're actually following democratic principles, which to be fair, these people never claimed they were following democratic principles, you would allow a full vote to happen, and blacks would obviously win the votes because they outnumber everybody else. And would they automatically vote for the blacks? The answer is yes, because the politics were racial. And so let's talk about those politics. In order to maintain their power, how does any minority group maintain power over majority populations? There has to be some scheme they're doing, some trick, some power play, something. In the case of the Afrikaans, they implement a system called apartheid. Now, what in the world is apartheid? So, apartheid is this word right here. You need to know it. It is an Afrikaans word. And it means apart, separated. It literally means separated. So what the hell is it? It is a legal segregation of the entire country. Now, thankfully for you guys, you know a bit about segregation from the American South. So it is like that, but like times 5. It is way more restrictive than American South segregation was, right? So you can see the sign here. For use by white persons, this public premises and the amenities thereof have been reserved for the exclusive use of white persons, obviously in English. And then here you are again in Afrikaans, the same sign. Now, this is something you would see on water fountains, bathrooms, lunch counters, buses, etc. in the American South. So that part is not so interesting or different. But apartheid goes far, far, far further. So one of the things apartheid does is it kind of takes a page out of the American expansion west. So if you remember the American expansion west, Americans had to deal with the fact that you had, I don't know, millions of Native Americans living in the center of the country. What do you do with them? If you want to take the country and establish states and territories and take away the land for yourself, what do you do with these people? Well, you only have a couple options, right, to do with any population if you want to take it over. You got to kill them. You got to integrate them, or you're going to have to confine them in some way. So what we did in America was a combination of kill them and confine them in the form of reservations. If you remember reservations, they were quite literally these carved out pieces of land on a map in which the American government said to Native American tribes, the Sioux now live here, the Blackfoot now live there, the Cherokee now live there, and the Comanche now live there, and get your asses over there or you're going to get a bullet. And that was basically what happened. They kind of do that here. So imagine, they very much do that here, except it's even kind of worse. So imagine taking the Southern American segregation concept, combining it with the reservation concept of Native Americans, and then go another step further and create actual restrictions on basic human rights depending upon your racial category. And to make it real straightforward, apartheid had basically 4 racial categories, okay? So let's see if I can find a quick list. I always like having visuals. And if I can, I'll just talk you through it. Nope. There you go. They have it right here. So these are the 4 basic racial categories, which is why I wanted to bring up this demographic chart, because it's the same thing. This is what they called them. You were either white, Asian, colored, or black. That was it. Those were what you were. And you can see here the levels of income in South Africa during this era. Let me scroll up to get my... No, let me not do that. Let me do... I don't want that. No, I don't want to move my screen because it's a pain to move my face around. I'll take the frame. I'll be moving without the frame. It sucks. It's a pain. All right, so we'll just leave it. So this goes from 1900 to 2020. So this is 2020 over here. And you got to learn how to read data anyway. It's on the AP exam, stuff like this. So pay attention. So what they're saying is, if all whites were considered to have an average income level of 100, it's just like a percentage, right? Not that they had all the income, just imagine you had all the whites in South Africa, you took all their incomes and you created an average, and you put that on the top of the list. And you say, okay, compared to them, how much income did the average of others have? And you can see that blacks had, by comparative purposes, let's take 1960 as a comparison, this looks to be about 10% of the income of whites at that same time. And this gray area is the time period of the apartheid state. Apartheid lasting from about 1950 to about 1995-ish, if I remember right. Feels right, 1995-ish. No, yeah, it's right, because I think actually right before the massacre of Rwanda is when the first free elections were held. So 1993, 1994, something like that. So anyway, the apartheid is happening during this time frame, between this 1950 to 1994, we'll call it. And you can see that black income stays pretty much static, which is not itself a problem. The problem is it's low, and it's the lowest in the country that they are the actual natives to. Now, you see Asians. Who are Asians? Remember I said Gandhi had visited South Africa and had been treated racially inferior? He is considered an Asian. Asian was literally anybody from Asia, from any part of Asia. This is still true in Britain today, by the way. So if you go to Britain and you're a Chinese, or you're a Pakistani, or you're an Afghan, or you're an Iranian, you're known as Asian. Like, you're just Asian. That's it. Like, and that's a big continent, obviously, with a lot of different people in it. You know, Russians are in Asia, and so are Vietnamese are in Asia. And they don't look alike to anybody, right? But nevertheless, they're considered Asians. So, but in this case, they really did mean basically peoples from Asia, especially the British parts of Asia, or British-owned parts of Asia. And as you can see, they had low income that eventually does rise because they are able to sort of occupy middling posts within society that the whites themselves don't want to occupy. And then you have colored. Colored was anybody of mixed race. So if you had a white parent and some non-white parent, you were colored. It was that simple. So colored, in America was used interchangeably with black. That's not the case here. Colored are a slightly higher scale. Now, the kind of restrictions on their lives were pretty shocking. So, for instance, they would have, as you can see here, Bantustans. What the hell is a Bantustan? This gray area down here is where you should focus. Bantustan means basically the Bantu was the word of those original Africans that had migrated throughout Africa. So the Afrikaners use that word to basically mean black African. So they call them Bantus, basically. So Bantustan is literally the homeland of the blacks. And so each of these little territories here, these little carved out, colored areas, these are the places they allotted to the blacks. So like your people now live here. And they would assign you a tribe. Whether or not you were historically part of this tribe had nothing to do with it. You were assigned a tribe. And so you have interesting things like this. So this is somebody showing their passbook. Now a passbook, and I will zoom in on this because I want to be able to read it with you. Perfect. So the passbook was a kind of like an ID card that every South African was expected to carry. And it would have a few bits of information on it. Number one, I'm just scanning what's up here to make sure there's nothing particularly... Nope, it's just an apartheid museum document. Good. Let's open the image itself. I want to zoom in. So a passbook was basically an identity card. And what it was is it limited where you could go or where you couldn't go. So, for example, this woman, Nozika, it looks like, Grace, that's her name. Her last name is Zwane. So, Nozika Grace is Zwane. Grace was probably like a baptismal name. These people were often Christian. They were converts. You know, that was a big part of this. And you can see her group. She is a Zulu. And she is from the tribe of Zulu. Now, is she a Zulu? Who the hell knows? But she certainly has been told she is. She might very well be, because the Zulus were one of the bigger, groups. But this is not like the old Zulu Empire. That thing is smashed. That's gone. This is now just black people living under the rule of these Afrikaners. And so what this says is basically, because of who you are, because of your group, because of your tribal affiliation, which is what the group and tribe thing is, that determines where you could go, where you could travel, who you could marry, what kind of job you could have, where you could work, etc. So you'd get these policies where, like, a woman like this could commute during the day on buses to, say, a white area of South Africa in order to be, like, household staff, to cook or clean or whatever it might be a housemaid for some white Afrikaner family, but had to leave by a certain time because the government would arrest her if she was found outside of her Bandustan, her assigned ghetto, for lack of a better term, because there really were like ghettos, and I'll show you in a minute, there's still ghettos. They're assigned ghetto for before nightfall. Like, that was basically the deal. And she couldn't travel to that home unless she had, like, documentation that she was employed by a white family there. So this was meant to quite literally herd the cattle together, for lack of a better concept, but that's really what it was. Herd the cattle together to keep them in line. Now, this kind of tension will obviously not last. It just can't. So what happens? What happens is the formation of a group called the African National Congress. Now, you may remember we talked about the Indian National Congress. This was a similar thing. In fact, the African National Congress got its entire concept from the Indian National Congress and watching Gandhi and watching Jawaharlal Nehru, and even to a lesser extent watching Muhammad Ali Jinnah. But where it goes different here is, although they are formed under the idea that they are going to be, like Gandhi, peaceful resistors to violence, they do eventually abandon that idea. And they become what you can only really describe as terrorists. There's no other way to describe it, just terrorists. So they start by attacking now their leader was the famous Nelson Mandela. So here's Nelson Mandela. He appears on textbooks throughout our school. Like, you guys have opened up books looking to do test corrections with his face on it. Some people sometimes think he's Morgan Freeman. Now, he is famous as an icon of global peace. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, etc. And did he deserve it? Probably. But he was also a terrorist. I mean, like, this is the problem. Like, there's no way around it. Like, these are realities. In a modern world's context, what he did was terrorism. And what he commanded was terrorism. So what did they actually do? Well, again, at first they were founded with the idea, the African National Congress, of running a peaceful protest campaign of nonviolence in the spirit of Gandhi. Eventually, though, a group within the African National Congress gives up that idea. And they call themselves the Spear of the Nation. And they are a militant group within the African National Congress that come to believe that there was no way to get progress in South Africa without violence, because violence was always coming from one direction. The Afrikaner South African government was happy to inflict violence on these people, and thus violence was justified. I mean, there are obvious connections and obvious sort of comparisons we made between what happens here in South Africa and what's happening in Gaza and Israel today. There are people who even will go so far as to say Israel is an apartheid state, as if to say that they subject Gazans to the same kind of restrictions and similar racial divisions and racial limitations as the South African government did here in South Africa. I think, my opinion is that there really isn't a lot of evidence to support that kind of a comparison. If you want to say it's an exaggerated comparison for effect, that might very well be. But, for a one-to-one comparison, I don't think that the numbers add up. But the world started to take serious action against South Africa for its continued apartheid policies, because these things will last right up until the 1990s. So, just as an example, from 1962 on, South Africa was banned from the Olympic Games because the South Africans would not allow anybody to compete on the South African team that wasn't white. So no black African was ever allowed to compete for the Olympics. Therefore, the Olympic Committee banned them and said you're not allowed to have these guys. Now, that sounds like a big deal, but this is the same Olympic Committee that 35 years before that thought Hitler would be a good host for the Olympics. So, I mean, it's hard to really judge. But the world did. Significant UN economic sanctions were imposed on South Africa. And that was really the tipping point where basic trade was not allowed to occur with South Africa until they reformed their racial politics. In the middle of all this, there were, as I said, violent movements against the government. And this group, the Spear of the Nation, these guys here, led by Mandela, which are a part of the ANC, they're the ones orchestrating this violence. Now, at first, the idea was, and you can read this yourself as I talk about it, the idea was originally to hit only hard targets. Hard targets meaning military targets, infrastructure targets, cable lines, railroads, disrupt communications, disrupt military operations, okay? Now, if you think about it, that's like in the spirit of international war. If you're attacking military targets, that's like fair game. Okay? Like if for example, if Hamas had limited its attacks in October to only military targets in Israel, it would have been just another day in the neighborhood, for lack of a better term, for that region. Targets that strike military, military targets, or strikes that attack military targets, are very common throughout that region. But they didn't stop there. Although they did attack military targets, they also attacked and murdered and kidnapped, obviously, civilians, and a great many of them. And so now that broadens the conflict, right? Because now you go from hard targets, which are military or military personnel or military bases or fortifications or infrastructure, and instead you start attacking things like banks, concerts, people in their homes. And now that's going after soft targets. And that's often seen as a war crime. It is a violation of every international statute. So these guys engage at first in these attempts to sort of stay on the hard targets. But that eventually ends. And they start to believe that they need to move on to soft targets, even if it means the death of civilians. And some of these things that the African National Congress's military group, the Spear of the Nation, did were actually pretty damn horrific. So I'll just give you some examples. From 1985 to 1987, the Spear of the Nation, again, led by Mandela, although Mandela was already in jail by this time, they would bury landmines in rural roads in order to hopefully blow up Afrikaner military, tanks, vehicles, and things like that. But they really only ended up killing a bunch of their own civilians who, while using the road, happened to, say, for example, walk a cow over it, which was heavy enough to trip these mines, blowing up and killing. I mean, even they admit at least 23 dead of black African laborers and civilians killed by these landmines planted by the Spear of the Nation. They would blow up banks, which would kill, obviously, civilians. So, I mean, you can see as I just scroll through, 37 civilians injured, 2 killed. Multitude of bombs at restaurants and fast food outlets, including Wimpy's. You don't know what Wimpy is? It's like a burger joint. Supermarkets. I mean, this is the kind of stuff Hamas does. We're going to buses, going to supermarkets, going to banks, and blow the place up with suicide bombers. These guys didn't typically use suicide bombers. They would use actually bombs, like planted bombs. But it would absolutely kill civilians, and they knew that. They understood that that's what they were doing. The idea was, again, their justification was, well, as long as we are being kept in this condition of apartheid, which is perpetual violence, we will never be able to get out of this unless we inflict violence upon your people in the same fashion. So this is very similar echoes to Gaza, Israel right now. This idea that the Gazans believe the Israelis are engaged in perpetual violence against the people of Gaza. And then, of course, the Israelis saying, well, wait a minute, we're just trying to live our lives separate from you guys, and you're attacking us. Therefore, we're retaliating, and you're going to take it. Like, you know, there's again, where's the right answer? Who's the good guy? That's very simplistic analysis of history. Because, again, these terrorists come to garner the sympathy of the world. And the world starts to side with them. Because, you know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. You know, if he's your guy on your side fighting for your cause or cause you enjoy, they're not a terrorist anymore. They're a freedom fighter, right? But of course, if you're the guy the freedom fighter is shooting and blowing up, and you had kids on that bus or kids in that supermarket and they died in a terrorist attack, you better believe that those are terrorists now. So it's like there's all these shades of gray. But it eventually does actually work. I mean, the truth is, the military strikes and the terrorism aside, the fact is the world turns on South Africa. It simply won't allow it to continue. It just simply won't. So eventually, and let me go back to our timeline, eventually a decision is made by the South African government to end apartheid, release Nelson Mandela. Now, Nelson Mandela had been jailed in connection with a terrorist activity that he had at least planned, if not participated in. And he was held without charges and without trial, as I remember, or it was a show trial, perhaps. You take a look at it if you like. And he was held there for many, many years, 30 years, some ridiculously long time. I'd have to actually look up exactly how long he was there. It wouldn't be that hard, actually. Here he is. Hold on. That's Mandela. And you can see he's not a happy fellow. I mean, he was, as I said, he engaged in these activities, which are absolutely... that's him as an old man. That's him as an old man. Okay, so as an older man, this is him voting after he's been released from jail. He became a symbol, like a martyr of the cause of freedom in South Africa. And his crimes, such as they were, even the ones that were legitimately crimes, were quickly forgotten by the world as just a consequence of the horrific treatment. The world turns on South Africa. It absolutely, as I said, puts the screws to them economically and culturally. They become a pariah state, meaning that nobody will do any business with them, nobody will talk to them, nobody will trade with them. And eventually they just have no choice. The white African government realizes that the writing is on the wall. If they don't sort of get out now and cut a deal now to bring in democracy, they might lose everything. So before, for example, people lost their personal property or anything like that, or if there was an actual revolution that led to the loss of personal property, or even just flat-out bloodbath of the white elites, the decision is made at the highest levels of government to actually begin the process of turning over the government to a full democratic process, allowing people to vote of, traditional sort of voting ages, whether they're black, white, colored, or anything. Like, that was the deal. And of course, once that happens, to nobody's surprise at all, Nelson Mandela is named and voted in as the first president of South Africa, with some degree of deservedness. As I said, he was an early member of the ANC. He was the leader of their military wing. He had gone to jail for decades and decades and decades. I remember him getting out when I was in 6th grade. It was a big deal. I remember distinctly, him being released from jail was current event news, in the way Gaza and such is current event news now. We talked about it in class. I don't forget it. And so he becomes the new president of a black South Africa at the head of South Africa's only real political party, which is the African National Congress. That party still runs South Africa to this day. Is South Africa a success story in Africa? Well, that's where opinions start to differ. So if you look at South Africa current, you get a lot of sort of, not currency, sorry, current. I don't want that. That's for fishing. Sorry. Sure. South Africa's kind of a mess right now. You have the African National Congress. Mandela's long dead now from old age. The African National Congress has become an extremely objectively corrupt organization. Its political leaders have run the country really into destitute ruin. They are kleptocrats. By that I mean they're people who, with the power of government, tend to reward themselves and make themselves enriched in kind of the expense of the people. South Africa is not a safe place. Black criminal African gangs do kidnap people of money and means with the intent of taking hostages for ransoms. It is not uncommon for Africans of any means, black, white, or otherwise, today to hire actual private police to actually police your house. Like, remember, like with a credit card, like you hire these guys. And there's a lot of these sort of stories that go on. South Africans' kidnapping problem is quite severe. So South Africa kidnappings, they're rough. It's a real problem. Again, even right now, it's a real problem. So here are just some cases, and if we kind of put the date to more there's way more modern than that. What's going on here? All right, I don't know why they're out of order, but there's so many of these. Like, it happens all the time. And so they do hire some pretty rough and tumble kind of organizations. They're kind of like mafias, get hired to protect your family. If I type South Africa private security, right, there's a whole private security industry in South Africa where you can pay for firms to basically protect your life, for lack of a better term. They will protect your house. They show up with machine guns. They are absolutely not in any way, shape, or form. Sorry, I don't know if this is South Africa or not. Yep, this is South Africa. A lot of these guys are not police. These are guys who are, private security. And they're hired and they're fully armed with automatic weapons, with bulletproof vests. Many of them are former military of other nations who are paid very, very well to come and fight or come and basically fight and be bodyguards in the South African secret police services. And again, these are companies, you pay them. It's like paying Uber. And they absolutely do and are able and are willing to engage in massive amounts of violence in their attempts to protect clients and make profits. That is what they do. Let's see, is this one of them? This is one of them. So the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority is literally the South African government's regulatory agency of these organizations. And like I said, you could absolutely hire one. They're out there, and they are a major industry. So South Africa now has a very mixed legacy. You'll see in our timeline, if I go back to it, which might take a second. South Africa is known as the Rainbow Nation. This idea that it's a place where whites and blacks can live in culture and racial harmony. That certainly was a dream of this time period where, in the 1994, 95, when it was sort of seen as a glowing and new idea. But the simple and unfortunate truth is that the Rainbow Nation never really did materialize, despite the fact that it has been a lot of progress in South Africa, and it's certainly not the most deadly or dangerous country in Africa at all. It's probably the most toured sub-Saharan African country for tourism purposes. It's nevertheless quite a risky bit of business to be there, go there, and so on. Especially these days, things have gotten quite hectic of late. But all the same, it is a mixed legacy. There are absolutely things to say, yep, there's real success here. If nothing else, apartheid was obviously a morally bankrupt system that existed far, far too late in the human history. Remember, I told you, if you're going to judge cultures, you don't judge them on our values, you judge them on the values of the time. And at the time of South Africa's apartheid, everybody on planet Earth looked at that system like, what is this? Like, what are you doing? In the same way that nations would look at America's segregation, like, what are you doing? What are these laws? How do you treat, like, it was a relic, the British were way ahead of us on stuff like that. And so were the French and a number of these other countries. But South Africa continued this process into my childhood. I was born in a world where South African apartheid and a jailed Nelson Mandela were real things. So, yeah, that's your South Africa. I'd love to be able to tell you, like, hey, now things are great, but they're not great. Just like I can say with India, and hey, now things are great, but they're not great. India's got nukes pointed at Pakistan. Pakistan's got nukes pointed at India. This ain't good. So yeah, as you'll see, there isn't the ride off into the sunset, and everything's got a bright future. South Africa has a ton of potential, but it is held back by guys like Ramaphosa and Jacob Zuma. These guys, this guy was a particularly corrupt individual who was quite willing to raid the government coffers, the treasury, to enrich himself. I mean, you can look into it if you really care, but he was not a particularly nice dude and also not a particularly effective leader. And, a lot of these African countries suffer from having a one-party state, which means that they actually have only one political party. So when you're voting, you're not voting for Republicans versus Democrats. You're voting for which Republican versus which other Republican, which Democrat versus which other Democrat, and that's it. So, sometimes the differences between these people is not really that significant, and there's no real challenge to the party power, so the party's platforms, whatever they may be, good, bad, or otherwise, tend to stay in place with inertia. All right, we've hit the over 1 hour mark. I'm getting a little tired, so I'm going to go ahead and call it there. Thank you guys for joining in. We'll do at least one more of these next week. We might do two, because obviously the test is on Wednesday. Maybe we'll do like a Sunday evening, Tuesday evening kind of thing. We can make a timeline of all important events we should know. Yeah, so Victoria, what you're asking was what somebody else asked, and I think we will do exactly that, actually, where we do need to make... I can't give you a timeline of all important events. That's like the whole course. But a lot of people want to know, like, all right, Malvagno, you keep talking about these time periods and, like, the stuff that sort of bookmarks world history. Yeah, we can definitely do that. What you're talking about is actually a core skill. It's called periodization. In other words, like, what makes up the classical age and why do we call it that? What makes up the industrial age and why do we call it that? Why do we stop history at 1910 and not go to 1911 or 1912 or 1913 or 1914? Why do we call that little piece of... Why is the course, for example, call that a unit? Why stop there? Why not go 10 more years or 10 less years? We definitely will do that. I don't know if that's a good thing for a class or a stream. We'll see. I'll think about it. I got a couple days, obviously, this weekend to sort it out. But I'll see you guys in school tomorrow. And we'll talk then. All right? Maybe we'll even do it tomorrow. Maybe that'll be what we do on a Friday. We'll do this timeline thing. There's actually a game I have. I'd have to find it. But it's a fun little review game. And what it does is it gives you years and it gives you events with no dates. And you have to put them in the right order. So you start with one date, that's one event, another event, another event. Yeah. I mean, don't get too excited, right? It's 9:38 at night, and the odds of me finding it by 6:15 in the morning tomorrow is pretty low. But I'll do my best. I mean, whenever possible, I try to make the kids happy. But if not, it could be a Monday or Tuesday thing. You never know. All right, adios, gang. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.